Yeah, sorry for this delay.
No, not at all. It takes time to set up.
Yes, this is a problem. This is a limitation of Zoom, but I can say that despite it's 30 minutes, but it's really informative, and we are really enjoying every minute with you, sir.
Thank you.
So Muhammad is
Okay.
here. Muhammad is
I think Muhammad is already here.
Yes, please.
Let me. I was just telling Muhammad, are you there?
Well, he's here.
Anyway, so I was telling you just about this guy because I think you need to look at his work. He only has one book, but it's very interesting. It's about the design of this cathedral, and how is it that the connection between music and architecture is something that could benefit both, because the structure of music and the structure of architecture follow similar logic. But going back to the issue that you raised, and you talk about the Egyptian house, and you talked about the definition of the Egyptian house. You're right. I mean, you have to ask, which house are you talking about? What I cannot completely accept is the idea, and it's a term that you refer to, that we almost have to go back to Abl Usrat Muhammad Ali and sort of understand or try to develop what was there before. Because in a sense, it's an ahistorical approach. It does not recognize that Egypt has changed, the country has changed. And it has changed irrevocably, in my opinion. And by this, I actually mean that one has to recognize that there come a time where even a colonial history is part of one's history. Being dominated, and of course, there's quite a lot of work that has emerged on this particular topic at the end of the 20th century by the cultural historians and the cultural theorists, who actually argue that colonialism itself, even if you assume that the Muhammad Ali family was colonial, which I don't, but colonialism itself changes the colonized and the colonizer, and it changes them in ways that cannot be forgotten. Yes, the colonizers have to, at some point in time, atone for what they have done, and the colonized have to gain independence and free themselves from partly this legacy, but they have to recognize how it has changed them in a manner where there's just simply no return. So I think what needs to happen here, if you guys were to pursue this approach further, is to ask questions that relate more to what is the nature of that Egyptian house, or come up with a typology of the Egyptian house. A typology, for example, that would recognize the fundamental distinction between urban and rural, distinction that did not really exist fully in Egypt, I would argue, almost until the time of the Arabs, because until then, Egypt was a country where the predominant population lived in rural areas and not necessarily in urban areas. And that definitely was the case during the time of the ancient Egyptians, during the time of the Ptolemaics, during the time of the Romans, and during the time of Byzantine rule. And in a sense, it also continued like that for many years during Arab presence until the time of the Fatimids. It's the construction of cities with very specific houses, that's why you actually made a statement I would never make, and your statement is quite bold, that there was this continuity almost from ancient Egypt all the way to the Muhammad Ali family. I as a historian who studies dwellings, I cannot make that statement. I think that there were fundamental changes that occurred over time. So that statement itself needs to be re-examined a bit. You need to identify certain typologies. I fully agree with you that there has been a major change with the rise or the presence of Arab and Islamic civilization, and another change with the coming of modernity. I would argue maybe in the beginning of the 19th century, and accordingly with the Muhammad Ali era. Maybe that typology would allow you to be more specific, like which type of Egyptian dwelling you are trying to address. Going back to a question that actually Walid posed to me earlier, which I didn't fully answer. If you ask me today, what is the Egyptian vernacular? I will tell you it is not what you actually find in Cairo, in areas that are designed by architects. It is not what you find in villages built by mud brick or adobe. It is actually what you find in ashwaiyat, the informal sector, whether we like it or not.
هي دي البوينت بالظبط، انه احنا ما نقدرش نعتبر العشوائيات انها vernacular architecture.
ليه؟
ولا نقدر؟ مش
لا
عارف
نقدر
يعني.
بالعكس. انا my proposal to you is it depends on how you define vernacular. If you define vernacular, what is vernacular? The term vern itself in Latin means of the masses, by the masses, and for the masses. Vernacular, if it's by the masses, for the masses, I have to accept العشوائيات as the vernacular. We may not like it, but there are examples around the world where precisely this form of construction became the vernacular over time that got very much appreciated. I have an article that makes this point, written more than 30 years ago, in which I argue that some of what we really love about medieval European cities, places like Siena and Florence and Venice, many of the things we like actually about them today were a product of this lack of coordination, spontaneous construction, which later got disciplined by certain forms of regulation that created these structures and gave them a colorful appearance. So in a sense, very often what starts as spontaneous, irregular vernacular becomes, after a very long time, the actual heritage that people appreciate. One of the best examples of that are the favelas of Rio. The favelas of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. This is precisely the عشوائيات of Brazil. It's people who did not have access to land. They decided to build where? On hills very inaccessible. They had no water, they had no electricity, they had no roads. But this practice has been going on now for almost 70, 80 years. Today, many of these areas, many of these favelas in Rio in particular, have been upgraded. They now all have water, running water. They all have electricity. They have roads. They have staircases. Some of them even have cable cars that connect them to other areas and suspended telepherique بنسميه بالعربي. And more than that, people upgraded these units. They added color to them. The government provided specific grants to improve them. Today, there's something called favela tourism. People go to Rio to go and visit عشوائيات. Now, of course, I cannot say that this is ever going to happen in Egypt, because the عشوائيات in Egypt, from the start, and because of the, I can't really say the absence of taste, because of the tremendous needs of people, became inhuman. They have spaces that would not even qualify as prison spaces. As you know, there are عشوائيات in القاهرة بالذات, but everywhere. Mansoura, Rashid, Dumyat, 8 and 9-story structures without an elevator that overlook a street that is no more than 2 meters wide, with another building right in front of it, that you can stretch your arm and say hello to someone else. Structures where for the bottom 7 floors, there is no air and there is no light, there is no sun. So it's the extreme unhealthy situation. The government in Egypt today, as you probably know, is trying to demolish these عشوائيات. They think they have to, and it's actually not a bad idea. But it's impossible to demolish 75% of the built environment of Cairo today. And even if you were to demolish it, the solutions that they've come up with of other high-rise structures that look exactly like the public housing that failed all over the world is not going to solve the problem. A solution that took into account what people built on their own is very important. And that's why I would argue, and I appreciate your intervention to say, how can we consider the عشوائيات the vernacular? We, as architects, we're all incensed by this idea. How can we do that? But whether we like it or not, the vernacular is not defined by us. The vernacular is defined by people. That is the vernacular of Egypt today, whether we like it or not.
التعبير هي vernacular طبعا، هي ما نقدرش نقول انها مش vernacular، بس هو السؤال هي ليه رديئة؟ يعني ليه الفرنيكولار اركيتكتشر اللي هي التراكميه اللي الانسان طلعت منه حتى زي في الحيوانات؟ يعني حضرتك طبعا عارف كتاب الشهير انيمال اركيتكتشر، النمل ازاي بيبني خبره تراكميه على مر عصور، يعني ملايين السنين. ليه الانسان دلوقتي لما بقى بيبني من غير اركيتكت ليه بيطلع المباني العشوائيه بهذا القبح؟ هل ده تاثير الراسماليه؟
ايوه طبعا، جزء كبير جدا منه مش تاثير حاجه واحده، هو تأثير يعني العشوائيات في مصر بالذات are a product of immediate need and the inability to recognize basic standards of public health, basic standards of aesthetic, a number of things that have disappeared from Egyptian popular culture in general. When you talk about, and I know a lot of people in Ashwayat, part of my research dealt with it. I have a book called Urban Informality that looked at this very specific phenomena, and it's a phenomenon worldwide, but in the context of Egypt itself, it has created some of the ugliest and the least healthy structures that you can ever imagine. And I cannot imagine the reason being anything other than very limited resources that people have. As I was telling Walid earlier, also you have to remember the culture of Ashwayat is a culture of escaping the law. So when you have no restrictions at all placed on you, and you can operate outside of the law and get away with it, which, as you probably know, most people have gotten away with it, and the government has even legalized the way of getting away with it by tasaluh. So you build something, it's inhuman. It's inhuman to do so, but you pay a price, you pay money, and you can maintain it and you can keep it. And in a sense, the people who paid the fee, that tasaluh, they're the ones who are not going to live in these poor communities, because it's people who are renting from them. Again, you have to remember, one of the major statistics of Ashwa'iyat is today 60% of people who live in Ashwa'iyat are renters. They're not owners, they're renters. They rent in Ashwa'iyat, and they rent in a manner that is also so expensive that, you know, a 2-bedroom unit in Ashwa'iyat, مثلا زي حتة بولاق الدكرور, now would actually rent for something like, you know, 3,000 pounds a month. That's amazing. When you think about it, when people who are under rent control from the time of Nasser are paying for a 2-bedroom unit in Du'i 50 pounds a month. ففي an irregularity here that the government has not been able to resolve. But I go back and tell you that under extreme conditions, people decided they're going to give up any aesthetic concerns. It's not that they don't have any. In fact, when you look at the earlier Ashwa'iyat from the 1950s and 60s, the phenomenon itself goes back to the 50s and 60s. It exploded in the 70s, and it became the pattern of construction after the 80s in all of Cairo. So when you look at that, you'd actually find that they would still paint structures. I remember attending, inviting someone to give a talk at my university at Berkeley in the early 80s. And she gave a talk about the colors that people, Dr. Zakia Shafi, who was a professor at Cairo University.
Yeah, we know her.
She gave a talk about the colors that people use in the exterior and interior of al-ashwa'iyat that they do on their own for مناطق زي بولاق الدكرور. It was fascinating. Everybody was interested in it, because her argument was, and this again goes back to what you and Walid are talking about, her argument, which was not very scientific, it was just an observation, that these colors are the same colors that were used on ancient Egyptian temples. You see? So you know, establishing that connection is very difficult to prove. But that was her argument, that in a sense, it doesn't even matter if it's difficult to prove or not. Why is it that they use blue on the exterior in these very specific floors? And I don't know if this paper has ever been published, but my point is that something actually happened to Egyptian taste over time, that even al-ashwa'iyat represented to some extent some Egyptian quality or characteristic back in the 70s and early 80s. And over time, and that's why, for example, you find now in the Mu'azzam al-ashwa'iyat, they're not finished. People put bricks and concrete, and that's it. And they leave it outside. They don't care, even though they're very well finished inside, you know? So it's that schizophrenic existence. It's what's inside my house is what matters. What's outside, I don't care.
Doctor, if you allow me, Muhammad, you can allow me for one question?
Yes, go ahead, Walid.
If we follow the same logic and taking your statement that something happened to the Egyptian taste, can we say something related to music, as Muhammad mentioned, that following the same concept that Mahraganat music will be our traditional music in the future?
Oh, absolutely. Oh, I fully agree. And not just that, I would remind you again of another argument. When I was going to Cairo University in the 70s, Ahmed Adawiyya appeared. and Ahmed Adawiya was not allowed by اللي هي الجهات الموسيقية نقابة الموسيقيين to be considered a musician at all, and he was banned from radio for like 3 or 4 years. The power of his rhetoric, whether we like it or not, is that it continued, that over time he became legitimized, he became legalized. Today Ahmed Adawiya is in a sense the forefather of موسيقى المهرجانات. ومحاولة منع موسيقى المهرجانات is so dumb, it's so idiotic, it's so idiotic. هي مش عجبانة، هي عاجبة فئة معينة من الناس زي بعضه، بس الفئة دي موجودة والفئة دي مصرية، ما هياش غريبة علينا، وما هياش سعودية مثلا زي النقاب اللي جاء من دولة أخرى، لا ده بالعكس دي حاجة معجونة وطالعة من صلب مصر نفسها. فطبعا of course it will be the vernacular, and all vernacular always when it appears for the first time. لأن أي حاجة traditional at one point in time was an innovation, and innovation after time matures and it takes different forms. That's exactly what I expect will happen لموسيقى المهرجانات. موسيقى المهرجانات is influenced a lot less, going back to what Mohammed was talking about, with you know, the hybrid house that appeared as a result of the westernization during the era of Muhammad Ali. I would say that you have actually quite a lot of Egyptian music that got hybridized this way. موسيقى المهرجانات is not really hybridized at all. It is somewhat, and there is really nothing that is pure. Everything is always hybridized. The point is the extent by which it borrows from elsewhere.
Mohammed, can you allow me for another question? This is my last question to the doctor, and then the platform is yours. Hello?
مش question، هو يعني تعقيب على كلام الدكتور. كلام طبعا عظيم يعني. في ملاحظة كده إن هو قديما كان في بديل موضوعي للتعليم الأكاديمي، كان هو التعليم بالمشق.
صح.
بمعنى إنه كل واحد بيتعلم من شيخه، شيخ الصنعة. واحد بيتعلم من الوسطى بتاعه، والوسطى بيتعلم من الوسطى اللي قبله، وهكذا في كل مناحي الحياة بقى. حتى في الموسيقى يعني كان المشايخ كل واحد بيتعلم من شيخه. الشيخ محمد عمران متعلم من شيخه اللي معلمه المقامات الموسيقية ومعلمه امتى يقف والسكتات ومخارج الألفاظ وهكذا. في الاركيتكتشر نفس الكلام، وفي كل بقى في كل الأمور يعني. لكن احنا تحولنا إلى تعليم أكاديمي مع رداءة التعليم الأكاديمي بقى، إنه أصلا ما فيش يعني التعليم مش كل الناس بتنال قسط كافي من التعليم. فأعتقد أن ده يعني من الرؤية دي برضو ممكن يكون ده تفسير لأنه ليه العمارة العامية والموسيقى العامية طلع بالمنظر ده، إن هي ملهاش جذور. يعني هو بيعمل حاجة، هو بيحاول يقلد حاجة، لكن في نفس الوقت هو ما عندوش أصولها، مش متعلمها لا أكاديميا ولا متعلمها من شيخه.
صح. بس اقول لك حاجه محمد هنا ردا على الفكره دي، هي صح، الفكره صحيحه تماما. السوسيولوجيست، الاربن سوسيولوجيست بالذات اللي كتبوا في هذا الموضوع قال لك this is unfortunately one of the products of modernity of particularly of the late 19th and early 20th century. In what modernity did انها it cut many of the forms of the traditional forms of communication and of education. ففعلا يعني اما تيجي يعني تبص عليها، كان في professions معينه الواحد ما يعتبرهاش حتى professions، يعتبرها crafts. You always have to learn it from the master of the craft. With modernity, a lot of these things became يعني more disciplined, and they became more disciplined because of the rise of what is called disciplinary bodies. ظهور النقابات. النقابات دي أول ما ظهرت under the title of guilds in Europe in the 16th century. And that's why a lot of people actually consider that the origin of modernity in Europe is not industrialization of the 19th century, but the organization of guilds in the 16th century and the 17th century. For مصر هنا بالذات, you are absolutely right. We had a traditional system of producing everything. With the rise of modernity and the incoming of modernity in all aspects of life, during the era of Muhammad Ali and Khedive Ismail, and absolutely continuing with the Republic of Nasser, you established new forms of education and of communication and of knowledge altogether, which were not necessarily copies. Modernity is here to stay. Modernity has taken hold, and yes, of course, there's quite a lot of mimicry. في تقليد، احنا قلدنا ناس كتيرة، وفي التقليد ده we did not necessarily take into account our own history. It happened. We cannot deny that period. The only thing we can do is deal with what we have right now. And dealing with what we have does not necessarily mean, or is not necessarily going to be done right, if we say, let's ignore a historical period and go back to this very specific point in time.
Doctor, can you allow me for one final question, if time permits us?
Go ahead. Yes.
We can stay with you for days. So just.
No, it's okay. I think this. I don't know if you still have another 20 minutes of this 40 minutes.
Yes, we have.
Go ahead.
Okay. Very generous of you. Muhammad, yes. I will take this question. I will leave the platform to you.
Okay, اتفضل. خلاص كده أنا.
Okay, Anna, how do you see, Dr. Nizar, how do you see the future of architecture worldwide after this pandemic, COVID-19, and in Egypt? I know it's a very wide question, but we can specify it in how the current buildings will be protected against pandemics with its current structure.
لا وشوف أنا الحقيقة في الموضوع ده بالذات أنا my view is somewhat different than many others. But أنا I'll tell you if you want to look at that and it's recorded. An organization that I established some 33 years ago called the International Association for the Study of Traditional Environments, IASTI. This is an organization that has now 500 members throughout the entire world. We had a conference that was actually called Virtual Traditions that was supposed to happen in September of 2020, this past September.
Yeah.
And we had to cancel it, of course, because of the pandemic. But instead, what we did was we did a virtual symposium, just a 3-hour symposium, which exists on the web. And you'll find it in the association. It's IASTE, IASTE.org. So we did actually a seminar or a symposium, which was 4 speakers, myself and 2 other commentators, about how the pandemic is likely to impact both traditional settlements and the study of traditional settlements. You may find actually that useful for your own work, for your dissertation more than anything else. One of the things that I actually talked about here is, it was very interesting that the early statistics that we got from the pandemic, at least back in September of 2020, we discovered that some of the areas that were least impacted by the pandemic were the more isolated traditional settings, because communication with the outside world was somewhat limited. They knew what was going on. They almost cordoned themselves. So they managed to protect themselves. And so in a sense, we know that the traditional settlements, which were not necessarily very dense and existed in isolated places around the world, are the ones that suffered the least impact, if any impact at all. We also know that the greatest impact actually happened in very dense urban areas. Very dense urban areas, whether they happen to be rich or poor, except that we also know that density is unfortunately a problem for the poor much more than it is for the rich. The rich can escape density, have other places to live, and so on and so forth. My prediction was that pandemics always come and go. It's very difficult to design for them as if they're going to be there forever. And the reason is that over time, as people forget them, people go back to their normal way of doing things. So, for example, and I'll give you a very specific example. I live in California, as you know. California is a seismic country. I mean, we have an earthquake every 2 weeks or 3 weeks. And every maybe 10, 15 years, we have a massive one. But we've learned to live with it. What we've done is with every single earthquake we get, the codes change in California. They improve because we learn something more about the behavior of building in response to earthquakes. So that upgrading of code is a very good thing, but it's also a very bad thing. Why? Because you can upgrade a building, you can spend 50, as we did actually in my own building, in my own school of architecture, a structure that was built in the 1960s. We had a massive earthquake in the 80s, as a result of which nothing happened to the building, but the codes changed. So the building rating went down. So we had to actually redo major parts of the building. We moved out of it. We spent $34 million basically bringing it up to new code. And then we had another earthquake in the late 90s, and suddenly the code changed again. So the building, which actually had a poor rating after the first earthquake, and we had an excellent rating after the seismic upgrade because of the code, got another good rating instead of excellent rating or very good, only a good rating after the second earthquake. So the point here is that at least there's a way by which you can legislate doing so. I expect that dealing with the pandemic should definitely have a similar impact. Perhaps it would result in regulations regarding social distancing. Perhaps it would result in regulation regarding openings in windows. I suspect that the majority of the changes, because of the nature of this very specific pandemic, it's not like the cholera or it's not like the Black Death, and it's totally preventable if you wear a mask, for example, and you're vaccinated. So I suspect that the changes are likely to be more at the urban level and not necessarily at the building level. I also expect the changes to be something that has to do more with human behavior and not necessarily urban codes. So I'm not necessarily a great advocate that, the pandemic would require the redesign of everything. I think the pandemic just made us aware as designers that there are certain things that we have to be careful about, and there are certain things that we cannot completely predict. And the problem is you cannot design for what you cannot predict. It's impossible. So there has to be a degree of flexibility in terms of dealing with it.
So we can tackle this by two things: either to design it for all pandemics, or at least for the building to be hygiene and immune against any future threat. This
Absolutely.
is first. And second, to consider that some people will not get access to vaccination.
Not only that, some people will also not get access to knowledge.
Exactly.
And that's sometimes even more serious. I mean, I can tell you the problem we have in the United States is not that. The problem today is that the media has created a degree of uncertainty regarding the vaccine because of Donald Trump and because of his news channel, to the extent that today 95% of those who are getting COVID in the United States, 98% even, not 95, I just got this information yesterday, are those who are not vaccinated, and they're getting sick and they're dying, but they don't believe that this is a pandemic. Okay. And there's nothing you can actually do to convince those people I mean, they think COVID is invented. It's something that the government invented to control them. And they come up with this. So in a sense, this is not necessarily even the absence of medical information. This is the insistence on certain individuals because of culture, because of subculture. Today it's the culture of the Republican Party. It's the culture that basically, in a sense, denies science or does not want to accept science. And these elements always existed in the United States. They are not new. It's just that we did not know how deep it was and the extent that it existed. We did not know, for example, that there is a connection between these individuals, these groups of individuals who happen to believe in a particular attitude towards the state and what have you, and the fact that they're religious. So the majority of them are Christian evangelicals. So these things appeared. And again, when you think about it, in Egypt, who are the people who are against vaccines? There are a lot of people from the religious community who are completely against vaccines for very similar reasons. There are a lot of people who also tell you, if God wants you to die, God wants you to die. Anyway. Exactly. I mean, whether you're Christian, evangelical in Ohio, or you are sort of a Muslim fundamentalist in Bashkil, it's exactly the same.
But we can say that the urban environment or the built environment will change anyway, but it's very early now to quantify this change.
Absolutely. And I think that the more difficult question is, even if we know that it will change and we don't know what kind of changes, what is our role as architects and planners in changing it? That is the more difficult question, because we don't yet have enough information on how to do so. But I'll tell you, I mean, there are certain things that one can be very creative about. So for example, I don't know if you know something about cholera and how cholera actually spread and how cholera was treated, because that's a very specific example that relates to the built environment. That at some point in time, the way doctors used to deal with cholera is that, you isolate people, you deal with it exactly like the Black Death. but they never made the connection between cholera and water.
And water, yes.
And until you actually get, so there's beautiful research on that, until someone, a doctor, decided, okay, he's actually going to trace where people drink from. And he managed to identify a particular well in a given site. And he managed to trace how is it that, all of these families were all drinking from that well, and isolated that well. And suddenly the cholera, rate of infection dropped substantially. So that was the beginning. It's being able to discover precisely that. Now, are we going to discover something like this with regard to COVID? I don't know. It's indeed possible. How is it that cholera impacted this? It impacted it in two different ways. Legislation was introduced that ensured that the supply of water in certain areas has to be clean. And in fact, all of the requirements for how to filter water go back to this time in England. So this is a seminal article that if you do not know it, you should definitely, I used to assign it to my PhD students in the methods course, because it has to do with how do you go about discovering something that you know very little about? What is the method by which you're almost like an investigator, a police investigator, trying to find the cause, and trying to do that, with the physical environment.
Yeah.
There's another group in England which is doing some very good work here. Yael Wiseman. I don't know if you know him. So Eyal Wiseman, E-Y-A-L Wiseman, W-E-I-S-M-A-N. He is at the Goldsmith School of Architecture. He's the dean. And he has a practice. That's his personal practice, but it's also his lab in the University of London Goldsmith School. It's called forensic architecture. Forensic architecture. And forensic architecture is almost like forensic doctors. Forensic doctors do what? They analyze, how a gunshot wound was made and who shot it and who's guilty. And so they do the same, but they do it with a focus on the built environment. What happened wrong, where exactly. And they've done some amazing stuff, much of which is in videos. He's also very active. He's an Israeli activist against the Israeli occupation of Palestine. So he's done amazing things, for example, about Gaza, and how is it that the Israeli army has bombed certain structures in Gaza in a manner that created a public health crisis. And how is it that that was deliberate? And he proves that. He proves that it's deliberate. The attempt is to kill people, if not by bombs, to kill them by spreading disease, by targeting certain areas, so on and so forth. And a lot of his work is published, and it exists as articles. I don't know if he has a book. He's a very good friend of mine, and I invited him to several conferences because his work is truly amazing, and it's very, very architectural, but it has a public health dimension. It has a sort of a legal dimension. It has
political dimension.
100%, absolutely. And he's banned from going to Israel because of his work, even though he's technically an Israeli citizen, because of that, because he actually proved that the Israeli army's attacks are meant to provide tremendous level of harm, not only by killing terrorists, no, by actually infecting the entire population with disease.
And hopefully someone takes action.
Yes, I don't know if that will happen. The world is a very complicated place, but it's amazing that you have actually people who dedicate their lives to things.
For sure. Just I will comment on that I have attended yesterday. It was Friday, yes, one lecture with German professor, and he proved that there is some sort of the concentration of CO2 and COVID infections. So the higher CO2 concentration is
the more COVID,
the more COVID infections are.
Oh, how amazing. How amazing. And of course, that means that in places like Egypt and Cairo, particularly, you have tremendous levels of pollution, or India or what have you, of course. Of course, that's a very good point. Yes.
And here they are working on.
What is it that we as architects can do about that? You see, that's where we are limited.
Exactly.
And I've always argued that, one of the best things that architects can do is always work within the frame of what is possible for them, and not aspire to change the world, because the world has to be changed in other mechanisms and other means.
Hopefully, yes. Doctor, I have finished my questions. I have thousands of other questions, but it's okay for today to just grasp
Well,
everything.
you know my email. You can always send me whatever questions you want. And you don't have my email.
No, I don't have.
It's very easy. It's my first name, Nizar@berkeley.edu.
Oh, it's on the website.
It's on the website, but it's Nizar@Berkeley, BERKELEY.edu. That's it.
Okay.
So I can send you. As you probably know, I'm in Cairo right now, but I'm leaving in a couple of weeks to go back to California.
Yeah, fantastic. Muhammad, في أسئلة تاني؟
Anything, Muhammad, that you'd like to add? We still have about 4.5 minutes.
5 minutes, yes. It's precious يعني the 5 minutes with Dr. Nizar.
أنا حابب أشكر حضرتك بس يا دكتور نزار على وقتك وعلى معلوماتك الغزيرة وعلى الحوار الممتع، ونتمنى إنه يكون في يعني زوم ميتينجز يعني لو وقت حضرتك يسمح يعني على فترات تكون مش بعيدة يعني.
Absolutely. I am always ready, and يعني دايما يشرفني إن أنا أتعامل مع يعني مصريين that really have the best interest of the country من خلال يعني it's very interesting. You people are unique الحقيقة في الحكاية دي، لأن الناس دلوقتي كلها ما بتعملش الكلام ده، كل واحد يلا نفسي، ويعني to find someone who's actually telling me there's an Egyptian house and I want to improve it. I find that really refreshing الحقيقة. Okay.
شكرا جزيلا.
Thank you very much, sir. Yes, thank you very much, and hopefully we will meet again and maybe in the coming near future. Thank you.
Inshallah.
Thank you very much.
مع السلامة.